What would your younger self say about how your family turned out?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Yesterday, I learned I was the backup plan for my own family, and the proof was sitting on my sister's driveway with a ribbon on it. For the fifth birthday in a row, my phone stayed silent. No card, no call, no quick text that at least pretended someone remembered. By noon, I had stopped checking every few minutes, convincing myself I didn't care, that birthdays were just another day, and that at my age, people should stop expecting anything anyway. I told myself all the things you say to numb the sting, even though deep down you know you are lying. Then, around 3 in the afternoon, I made the mistake of opening Instagram, and there it was, my younger sister standing next to a brand new car, smiling like a lottery winner, with a giant red bow across the hood. And there, in the caption, the part that burned, so grateful to mom and dad for the best birthday surprise ever. I just sat there staring, and I swear my stomach flipped. I wasn't even jealous of the car itself, it was what it represented. My parents had managed to ignore my birthday for 5 years straight, but they could still dig deep enough to finance a shiny vehicle for Lena, the same Lena who never paid back a single loan, who always had a story about how she was figuring things out, who couldn't hold a job longer than a season. Meanwhile, I had been paying my own bills since college, fixing my own car when it coughed smoke, and sending extra cash whenever a so-called family emergency popped up. It wasn't the car, it was the message. I was invisible unless they needed me. The comments under her post piled on the salt. Well deserved. Best parents ever. Family that always shows up. I actually laughed out loud, one of those bitter laughs where you can feel the tears waiting just behind it. I thought about the past 5 years, sitting through birthdays where the only thing I got was silence, sending Happy Mother's Day, flowers that went unacknowledged, calling on Father's Day, and leaving voicemails that never got returned. I thought about all the small sacrifices I had made, the bills I paid on their behalf when they claimed things were tight. I remembered the time I sent money to keep the electricity on at their house, only to see them post a week later about a weekend getaway. And suddenly it all clicked. I picked up my phone and blocked every single one of them. Mom, Dad, Lena, even my aunt, who always seemed to know more than she let on. I didn't do it out of spite. I did it because I finally understood I was the backup battery in this family, always plugged in and drained whenever someone else needed power, but never recharged myself. And I was done. That night, I sat down at my desk and pulled up my online banking. I remembered how years ago, Mom had convinced me to keep my phone line on the family plan because it was cheaper that way, and she promised she would pay me back every month. Of course, the money never came, and I was still covering half of Lena's unlimited data. I canceled the payment that night. I opened my streaming accounts, where my password had been passed around like a neighborhood flyer, and I reset them all, locking everyone out. I checked the joint grocery delivery account where I was somehow the one card on file, and I deleted it. One by one, I cut the invisible cords that kept me tethered to them financially, cords I hadn't even realized were still wrapped around me. While I was cleaning up my email filters, I stumbled on an old message I had completely forgotten about. It was a bank notification from years ago about a custodial savings account my parents had opened when I was a kid, supposedly to help pay for college. I remembered asking about it when I graduated high school, and they told me it had been rolled into family expenses, but the way they said it made me think it was just a temporary shuffle. The email showed the account was closed years ago. Not transferred, not paused, closed. Whatever money had been in it was gone, and it had disappeared without a word to me. I opened a folder on my computer and labeled it Receipts. Into it went screenshots of Lena's Instagram post, the comments, the old bank email, and copies of every digital breadcrumb I could find that proved how many times I had covered for them. It wasn't about revenge at that moment. It was about clarity. I had spent years gaslighting myself into believing I was exaggerating, that I was too sensitive, but when you start stacking the evidence, the picture is undeniable. Before bed, I took one more step. I filed a credit freeze at all 3 major bureaus. Not because I thought someone was stealing my identity, but because I suddenly realized I didn't trust my own family not to try. I had given Mom a scanned copy of my driver's license years ago to help with an insurance claim after a storm, and once that information is out there, you never really know how it's being used. A credit freeze was my way of locking the door. I went to bed that night calmer than I had been in years. Hurt, yes. Angry, absolutely. But calm, because for the first time I was not waiting for them to do the right thing. I was not hoping for a call, not wondering if maybe next year they would remember, not questioning whether I had done enough to earn their love. I had closed the accounts, built the receipts, and shut the door. And just as I was about to turn off my laptop, a new email notification slid onto the screen. Subject line, "Welcome, Carter Family Financing. Your cosigner preferences have been updated." It was from a dealership in town I had never set foot in. I froze. I had never applied for anything, never signed a single form. But there it was in black and white. My name had been tied to something I didn't agree to, and it was dated less than a week before my birthday. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just about birthdays anymore. It was about something much bigger. And I had no idea what I was about to uncover next. When I woke up the next morning, the anger from yesterday hadn't faded. Instead, it had sharpened into a clarity I hadn't experienced in years, a cold recognition of exactly who my family was and the role I had been forced to play in their lives. A role that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with convenience. I remembered how my parents always framed generosity as fairness, insisting that what they gave to one child was part of a larger plan for the family, while the truth was always a matter of preference, whim, and who could be used without complaint. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through the endless chain of posts, stories, and messages that had accumulated while I was away on a work trip that had lasted more than 6 months. A trip I had accepted to provide for the very same people who now treated me like I didn't exist. Lena's car was just the beginning. It was the most obvious evidence, but I started noticing patterns I had ignored. The subtle dismissals, the casual exclusions from conversations and decisions, and the quiet assumption that I would always absorb inconvenience and disappointment without protest. I realized I had been conditioned to be a safety net, a buffer, and a lender of last resort, and yesterday's gift, a new car, fully financed, fully celebrated, was the culmination of years of this behavior, a reward for being patient, for tolerating inequality, and for never questioning their favoritism. As I continued sifting through old emails, bank statements, and digital reminders of my financial contributions, I discovered more than just proof of their neglect. I found the careful architecture of their favoritism. The way they had systematically ensured that Lena received every advantage while I had been expected to patch gaps, make up shortfalls, and smooth over inconveniences, always quietly, always without acknowledgement. There were rent payments they never helped with, tuition payments they promised and never delivered, and repairs they expected me to cover while they laughed off the cost as trivial. Each item was a thread, and as I pulled at it, a pattern emerged, a pattern that made yesterday's birthday card not an isolated act of injustice, but a continuation of a lifelong strategy designed to prioritize one child over another, all under the guise of love, obligation, or family cohesion. By mid-morning, my focus shifted from the past to the present, to the steps I needed to take to reclaim autonomy over my life, because for too long, my identity, my resources, and even my emotional energy had been treated as communal property, to be spent, borrowed, or redirected at their convenience. I began drafting a list of accounts to separate, contracts to review, and legal measures to implement, making notes on each bank, loan, and shared financial instrument, mapping out a strategy that would ensure that no further surprises could reach me without my consent. Each entry was meticulous: credit cards, joint accounts, car insurance policies, utility bills, digital subscriptions, and any platform where my personal information could be leveraged. I understood now that what they had done with Lena's car was not an isolated incident, but a demonstration of the control they had always exercised, and if I didn't act now, it could continue indefinitely. By late afternoon, I decided I needed to confront the truth directly and document everything for my own records, not for them, because confrontation without preparation in this environment only gave them a chance to manipulate, excuse, or dismiss. And I had learned that lesson long ago. I opened a secure document and began detailing every incident of favoritism, every unfulfilled promise, and every moment I had been treated as secondary or expendable, making sure to include dates, financial figures, and communications. The act of writing was surprisingly therapeutic, a way to externalize decades of disappointment and invisibility, and it forced me to recognize how deeply I had internalized the idea that my contributions, sacrifices, and needs were optional while others were essential. As I wrote, I also traced the emotional impact of each event, recording how feelings of abandonment, frustration, and disbelief had been compounded over time, turning into a subtle but constant ache that had shaped my interactions with friends, colleagues, and even my own expectations for relationships. That evening, I reflected on the consequences of finally stepping away from the system that had exploited me. I imagined what my life would look like without the financial, emotional, and logistical weight of being the family's safety net. I considered how my interactions with Lena would change, how holidays and birthdays could be celebrated without the underlying tension of expectation, and how my parents would respond if they realized that their strategies had finally failed. I also understood the potential backlash, the criticism, and the guilt they might try to impose, but for the first time, I felt confident that their influence over me was limited by my own boundaries, not their manipulation. Late into the night, after reviewing every line of financial record, every account balance, and every documented conversation, I took a deep breath and felt a mixture of exhaustion and liberation. I realized that stepping away did not require anger or spectacle. It required clarity, precision, and commitment. I had spent years giving until nothing was left for myself, but now I had a plan to reclaim my independence, to ensure that any future gestures of supposed generosity could no longer compromise my autonomy. I closed my laptop, knowing that the path ahead would be difficult, that it would involve uncomfortable conversations and perhaps permanent estrangement, but also knowing that this was the first moment in years where I could look forward to a future built entirely on my own terms, without having to reconcile the expectations of people who had never valued me as much as they valued the convenience I provided. The day started quietly, but the quiet carried the weight of months of simmering resentment and unspoken truths, a tension that had been growing unnoticed while I was busy trying to maintain the fragile illusion of family harmony. And as I sat at the kitchen table, notebook open and pen in hand, I felt the undeniable clarity of realization wash over me, the understanding that what had happened with Lena's car was only a fragment of a much larger pattern, a pattern that had been repeating for us long as I could remember, disguised as concern, guidance, or parental support, when in reality it was favoritism, deliberate and consistent, leaving me to carry burdens that were never mine while privileges and gifts were extended effortlessly to another. I thought about how often I had absorbed disappointment with a polite smile, pretending that it didn't matter that my achievements were minimized and my contributions overlooked, and now, as I reviewed the evidence I had meticulously documented, the bank statements, the loan documents, the emails that never received replies, and the casual mentions of my brother's successes, I felt the clarity of how deeply ingrained this imbalance had become, and for the first time, I allowed myself to acknowledge the full extent of the emotional manipulation, the way my parents had conditioned me to feel grateful for scraps while expecting unconditional support for anything and everything related to Lena. Throughout the morning, I traced every incident of disparity, connecting moments that had previously seemed isolated or coincidental into a coherent map of neglect and favoritism, recognizing how these patterns had shaped my career choices, my friendships, and my own self-expectations, because I had been operating under the assumption that compromise, patience, and silent endurance were the measures of a responsible adult, only to realize that the same behavior had never been demanded from my brother, whose every success was celebrated without hesitation and whose every request was met with immediate support, a stark contrast to the constant delays, conditional approvals, and casual dismissals I had endured. And the more I laid out these details, the more I understood that what I had accepted as normal was a deliberate and consistent pattern designed to prioritize one child while expecting the other to adapt, tolerate, and absorb the imbalance without protest, a realization that filled me with both anger and an unexpected sense of liberation. By early afternoon, the initial shock had evolved into a strategy, a clear plan to assert boundaries that had never been acknowledged before, and I began drafting letters and messages that were carefully worded to state facts without apology, to establish expectations without opening room for manipulation, and to reclaim financial and emotional autonomy without leaving room for misinterpretation, because I understood that any hint of doubt or hesitation could be exploited to maintain the previous dynamic, and I refused to allow that to continue. I reviewed each shared account, loan agreement, and contract with a critical eye, identifying where my name had been leveraged for convenience and where my consent had been assumed rather than explicitly given. And I formulated a step-by-step approach to disentangle myself from these arrangements, knowing that the process would require patience, persistence, and precise documentation, because even a single lapse could allow the familiar cycle of expectation and obligation to resume. As the afternoon turned to evening, I thought about the personal cost of decades of quiet compliance, the friendships that had been strained because I prioritized family obligations over social engagement, the professional opportunities one had deferred to cover gaps created by my parents' favoritism, and the constant undercurrent of guilt imposed whenever I hesitated or requested fairness. And I realized that reclaiming control over my life would involve not just financial separation but emotional recalibration, a conscious effort to stop measuring my value against the arbitrary preferences of people who had repeatedly shown that they valued convenience over fairness and affection. And the process of writing all of this down helped me externalize decades of unspoken frustration, creating a tangible record of my experience and a blueprint for the boundaries I would enforce moving forward. Late in the night, I reviewed the day's work and felt a cautious sense of accomplishment. The notebook now contained detailed records of favoritism, financial exploitation, and emotional manipulation, along with a clear plan to protect myself from further intrusion into my autonomy. And while the path ahead promised confrontation, discomfort, and potential estrangement, I felt a steady confidence in the necessity of these measures, knowing that without them, the cycle would continue indefinitely, and any future generosity or support could be weaponized as a reminder of obligation rather than an act of genuine care. And as I closed the notebook and prepared for sleep, I felt a rare sense of calm, a quiet determination that for the first time in my adult life, my decisions would be guided not by imposed expectation or fear of judgment, but by the clear understanding of my own needs, priorities, and limits. And I knew that the coming weeks would test every aspect of this resolve, forcing me to act decisively in the face of familial pressure, but I was ready to reclaim control and establish the boundaries that would finally allow me to live independently of favoritism, obligation, and unearned guilt. The moment I realized the depth of their audacity came quietly, in the form of a phone call that should have been routine, but instead carried the weight of years of expectation and entitlement that I had long ignored. And as I listened to their familiar tones, carefully measured to sound concerned yet subtly manipulative, I felt a rush of disbelief mixed with a simmering anger that had been building beneath the surface, because here they were, the same people who had denied me the support I needed to pursue my goals, who had minimized my achievements and glossed over my sacrifices, now asking, no, demanding, that I co-sign yet another loan for my brother, as if the countless times I had covered his financial missteps, made excuses, and absorbed the consequences of their favoritism were somehow insufficient. I could hear the practiced inflection in my mother's voice, the way she paused, emphasized the words, "We need you," as if those three simple words could justify decades of imbalance. And I felt the familiar churn of frustration and disbelief in my chest, because this was not a casual request, but the culmination of a pattern that had been meticulously established. A pattern in which my brother's needs and wants were prioritized without question, while mine were continually deferred, questioned, or dismissed, leaving me with a persistent, gnawing awareness that no amount of compliance would ever equal the privilege granted to him. As I hung up the phone, The silence that followed was thick with contemplation and the realization that my response would set the tone for the years to come, that the choice I made in that moment would determine whether the cycle of expectation, guilt, and exploitation continued or finally broke, and I spent hours reviewing every interaction, every financial entanglement, every favor granted under the guise of family loyalty, and I mapped out a strategy that was deliberate, methodical, and uncompromising, because I understood that any hesitation or ambiguity would be used to perpetuate the familiar dynamic, and I refused to allow the history of favoritism to dictate the future of my autonomy. I meticulously gathered the documents, the statements, and the correspondence that illustrated a clear trajectory of inequality, and in doing so, I was not just preparing for a confrontation, but reclaiming the narrative of my own life, asserting that the years of silent compliance and unacknowledged contributions would no longer be a bargaining chip in a game I had never agreed to play, and the act of compiling this evidence filled me with a mixture of vindication and exhaustion, because while it was empowering to see the pattern laid bare, it was simultaneously exhausting to acknowledge just how long I had endured it without challenge. By mid-afternoon, I had drafted messages that articulated my refusal clearly and without apology, outlining the reasons with precision, emphasizing my commitment to my own financial and emotional boundaries, and yet doing so without the venom or accusation that might give them room to dismiss or counterattack, because I had learned that clarity and firmness, delivered without defensiveness, were far more effective than emotional confrontation, which had always been reframed by them as overreaction or ingratitude, and I read and reread every sentence, ensuring that each word carried weight and intent, knowing that this was not just a simple refusal, but an unambiguous declaration of autonomy and a redefinition of familial expectations. I anticipated the responses, the justifications, the pleas, and the attempts to invoke guilt, and I prepared my stance accordingly, reinforcing that my past support had been offered voluntarily, and while I would continue to engage with my family in meaningful ways, I would no longer be coerced into enabling behavior that had repeatedly demonstrated entitlement, irresponsibility, and disregard for fairness. As evening fell, I reflected on the larger implications of this confrontation, realizing that by asserting these boundaries, I was not only protecting myself, but also challenging the normalized imbalance that had long defined our family relationships. And I considered the ripple effects this would have on future interactions, holidays, shared responsibilities, and the silent expectations that had always accompanied my participation in family life, understanding that change would be uncomfortable, even painful for all parties, because disruption of entrenched dynamics always carried resistance, and yet I felt a steady confidence that the discomfort was a necessary price for integrity and self-respect, and that the liberation gained from no longer being complicit in favoritism and exploitation was worth every moment of tension that would inevitably follow. By the time I finally set aside the notebook and stepped away from the carefully curated evidence, I felt a sense of quiet resolve, an internal fortitude that had been cultivated over years of observation, endurance, and quiet resilience, because I had not only recognized the pattern of injustice, but had also taken tangible steps to dismantle it. And while the coming days and weeks would undoubtedly involve confrontation, negotiation, and emotional strain, I was prepared to face them with unwavering clarity, knowing that this was the moment I reclaimed control over my life, my finances, and my emotional well-being, and that the boundaries I had established would finally create space for fairness, respect, and genuine familial engagement, untainted by the persistent weight of favoritism that had governed our interactions for far too long. The confrontation I had long anticipated arrived with an intensity that was equal parts inevitable and surreal, a culmination of years of suppressed frustration, unacknowledged effort, and quiet endurance that had shaped my perception of family loyalty, because when the call came, I could immediately sense that the usual tones of polite insistence were replaced by a subtle, almost desperate urgency, as though they were suddenly aware that the dynamics they had relied upon for decades were no longer in their favor, and I felt a clarity of purpose that had been absent in previous interactions, a steadfast determination to finally assert my boundaries and claim the respect and recognition that had been systematically denied. And this awareness coursed through me with both exhilaration and a measured caution, because I knew that the coming dialogue would test every ounce of composure, patience, and strategic reasoning I had spent weeks preparing for. As I listened, their words carried the familiar requests, each framed with the practiced language of concern and familial duty, invoking obligations that were never reciprocal, appealing to guilt as if it were currency I could no longer afford to spend. And I realized that the pattern was not new, yet it was now confronted by a resilience forged through years of careful observation, internal debate, and conscious reflection, because the decision to finally refuse was not impulsive but deliberate, rooted in a meticulous assessment of every past encounter and every instance of inequality. And I understood that this moment was less about the immediate request and more about asserting a precedent that would redefine the parameters of my involvement in their financial and emotional manipulation. As the conversation unfolded, I maintained a calm, measured tone, choosing words that conveyed firmness without aggression, acknowledging past support yet clearly demarcating the boundaries I would no longer allow them to cross. And I could feel the subtle shifts in their responses, the hesitations that betrayed the discomfort of realizing that their long-established patterns of entitlement were now being challenged, because I had structured my reasoning with precision, addressing not only the immediate request, but also the historical context, demonstrating the cumulative consequences of repeated favoritism, financial dependence, and emotional exploitation, and in doing so, I transformed what could have been a moment of confrontation into an unambiguous declaration of autonomy and self-respect, a statement that my participation in family obligations would henceforth be guided by fairness, reciprocity, and mutual respect rather than guilt, obligation, or fear of conflict. I articulated my decision with examples and evidence, recounting instances where my support had been taken for granted, where my contributions had been minimized, and where my achievements had been overshadowed by the preferential treatment of my brother, and as I spoke, I could sense that the familiar defense mechanisms, justifications, rationalizations, and subtle attempts at emotional leverage were weakening under the weight of clear and consistent reasoning, because the narrative I presented was not accusatory but factual, illustrating patterns that were impossible to dismiss without acknowledging their own long-standing role in the imbalance, and the effect was palpable, a mixture of surprise, frustration, and begrudging recognition that I was no longer a passive participant in the cycles of expectation that had governed our relationships for years. By the end of the conversation, I had communicated my boundaries unequivocally, asserting that future requests for financial support would be considered independently of past obligations and without the implicit assumption of compliance. And I reinforced that my willingness to engage with family dynamics would now be guided by principles of fairness and mutual respect, principles that had long been absent but were now non-negotiable, because I had recognized that my silence and acquiescence had inadvertently perpetuated the inequities I sought to correct, and that by taking a firm and reasoned stance, I was not only protecting myself but also redefining the framework within which our familial interactions would proceed. As I hung up the phone, a profound sense of relief mingled with lingering tension, because while the immediate confrontation was over, the implications would reverberate through future interactions, reshaping expectations, altering assumptions, and challenging the ingrained dynamics that had long dictated the flow of support, favoritism, and recognition, and I understood that this moment marked a turning point, a deliberate shift from passive compliance to active, principled engagement, and although the path ahead would undoubtedly include challenges, negotiations, and adjustments, I felt a quiet confidence that the foundations had been laid for more equitable, respectful, and intentional relationships. Because I had reclaimed control over my choices, asserted my boundaries with clarity, and established a precedent that would guide not only the present but also the future, creating space for genuine connection and interaction free from the distortions of obligation, favoritism, and unbalanced expectation. In the hours that followed, I reflected on the years of patience, endurance, and self-restraint that had led to this moment, acknowledging the complexity of emotions intertwined with family ties, love, frustration, loyalty, and disappointment. And I recognized that asserting boundaries did not diminish the value of those relationships, but rather clarified the terms under which they could exist meaningfully, because only through explicit communication, consistent enforcement of limits, and unwavering commitment to fairness could the cycle of imbalance be interrupted, and I felt an overwhelming sense of empowerment, understanding that this was not merely an isolated act of refusal, but a comprehensive declaration of self-respect. A careful and deliberate step toward ensuring that the remainder of my interactions with my family would be guided by equity, honesty, and mutual acknowledgement of contributions and sacrifices, marking the definitive end of passive acquiescence and the beginning of deliberate, principled engagement.